Major conversation piece today is this whole idea of systemic racism brought to light by the murder of our brother George Floyd. President Trump and William Barr, head of the Justice Department, at the least are hesitant about this concept of systemic racism, if not outright denying it. William Barr did as much when he was asked if there were two justice systems in America. He said, no. This line of thinking is actually congruent with white evangelicals. In their seminal book, Divided by Faith, white sociologists Emerson and Smith said that white evangelicals see sin in personal terms and not systemic ones. Therefore, the white evangelical approach is to focus on the heart through evangelism and discipleship, a kind of discipleship that never gets around to justice. What are we to make of this? The Bible gives many examples of systemic injustice, which makes sense, because if we're all sinners and you get a group of sinners to build systems, those systems will be tainted with sin. In Exodus, we see Pharaoh instituting a system of injustice when he legislates that the midwives kill the Jewish baby boys. Centuries later, King Herod would institute this same system in his attempt to kill the Messiah. I mean, just think of that. If you're a mother in ancient Egypt or Palestine, when these edicts are mandated, what are you to do? You are facing not so much an individual, but a whole system that has been commanded to kill your child. In the book of Amos, God chastises his people for having unbalanced scales and defrauding the poor. What do we call this? It's an unjust system. In Luke 19, we see Zacchaeus, who is described not just as a tax collector, but as the chief tax collector, meaning he is overseeing an unjust system based on fraud and extortion. Jesus' cleansing of the temple is dealing with an unjust system that is not only based on a dishonest commercialization of the temple, but has overtones of racism because it is set up by these Jews in the only place Gentiles could worship. The court of the Gentiles, on and on we could go. But what about in America? Yes, systemic injustice exists today. Of course, we could see it in slavery. Jim Crow was also a system of injustice where blacks were largely denied the right to vote through the system. They're forced to go to substandard schools, sit in the back of buses, and denied tons of other privileges. There was even a book called The Green Book, which was solely written to help blacks navigate systemic injustice on road trips while keeping their humanity intact. During this period, you had things like convict leasing. You ought to read the book Slavery by Another Name, where a person could be arrested for jaywalking, charged a steep fine, knowing he didn't have it. He'd be sent to work in labor camps until he paid off his debt, something that would rarely happen given the exorbitant interest rates. Then there's housing. In the book, The Color of Law, it lays open the collusion that took place between the government, real estate agents, lending companies, and communities to keep blacks out. This process has been described as reverse redlining. Systemic injustice in housing continues today, most clearly seen in companies like Wells Fargo being found guilty for targeting poor black families and giving them loans they knew they could never pay. The devastation that was inflicted on African American communities in the 2008 financial crisis was so extensive, it led many cities to even sue the banks for these unjust loans. In many cases, the plaintiffs won. Systemic injustice is seen in the case of Colin Kaepernick in the NFL, which settled with him over the issue of colluding to keep him out, given his very public stance or knee on racism. Don't even get me started about Christian schools in the South. You know that narrative, don't you? Brown versus Board of Education happens in 1954. Christians in the South said, our kids will not go to school with black kids. So they knew they couldn't start alternative public schools. So what did they do? They started private Christian schools and priced blacks out. That, my friends, is systemic injustice.